Hello there, it's Mr. Athel here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about Macbeth, a little bit more about James I and how Shakespeare wrote it while James I was on the throne and what that means, and then a little bit about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's relationship, because if you're in my class, we're going to do a little bit of a mini essay on that theme next week. So, first of all, I want to talk a little bit about James I. So James I was on the throne, had only recently been put on the throne when Macbeth was put on. He'd only been on the throne for a couple of years. And James I is an interesting guy, and we can kind of consider Macbeth to have been written for James I. Now, James I was a little paranoid about the idea of someone coming and nicking the throne off of him. Him being on the throne was not clear cut. He wasn't the son of Queen Elizabeth who came before him. He was a cousin, and some people argued whether he should be on the throne or not. So he was on the throne, but his position was a little bit shaky. And so Macbeth can be seen to have been written for James I because it's got a core message in it of don't mess with the king. Don't mess with things that shouldn't be messed with. James also believed in something called the Great Chain of Being. And that meant that God chose who was on the throne, and God directed that, and so you shouldn't get involved in that. And it's interesting that Lady Macbeth calls upon evil spirits to help her to take the throne from King Duncan, and that's seen as an anti-Christian and anti-God thing to do. And so there's that underlying message that you shouldn't mess with the king. The phrase that I would use if I was writing about this in an essay would be, I'd say that Macbeth is a cautionary tale. So that phrase, cautionary tale, could be one that you could use to describe what Macbeth is in terms of how it relates to James I. Now, a little bit about Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. So Lady Macbeth and Macbeth have got a interesting relationship, and it's going to be their relationship that you could write about in the exam, and what we're going to be writing about in next week's lesson if you're in my class. So their relationship is one where Lady Macbeth takes control. Women would have been expected to have been subservient to men during this era, but Lady Macbeth subverts that and takes control and manipulates Macbeth and orders him around and makes him do things. So an early quote in terms of how she does that is when she tells him how to act in front of King Duncan. So she tells him to look like the innocent flower. So a metaphor is used, an innocent flower. A flower is beautiful and everyone likes to see it, and he's this perfect hero. It's quite an effeminate thing as well. So that's what she tells him to look like, but she also tells him to be the serpent under. So he's looking on the outside like a flower, but inside he's being a serpent. He's being sneaky. It's another metaphor, another one that we can talk about the connotations of in lots of detail. Serpent's also interesting contextually because the serpent appears in the Bible as the tempter of Adam and Eve right at the beginning, and in a very religious society, that serpent would be thought of straight away to be linked with that image. So you could bring in a little bit of context in the Bible for that quote. However, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth's relationship changes as the play develops, and I'm not going to talk about every detail. I'm just going to go through two more quotes, two more details in terms of the play, in terms of how their relationship changes. Later in the play, Macbeth takes a bit of charge, and he gets Banquo killed, and Lady Macbeth doesn't know anything about that, and their positions shift. And what Macbeth says to Lady Macbeth at that point is, he says to her, "Be innocent of knowledge, dearest Chuck." So we get that affectionate name. Be innocent of knowledge. You don't need to know about this. You can be totally innocent. So an interesting role reversal where their relationship shifts. So if we're going to talk about the relationship, we don't just want to talk about Lady Macbeth as the manipulator. We want to think about the moment when Macbeth kind of loses his conscience and takes control and becomes a murderous psychopath himself. By the end of the play, Lady Macbeth has died, and just before the end of the play, before Macbeth dies, he hears of Lady Macbeth's death. And when he hears of her death, you might expect a big emotional response from a husband who's just lost his wife, but actually he's very cold, and that reflects the journey that he's been on. Someone that initially is very troubled by his conscience, by the end is very cold and unemotional, and when he hears that she dies, his first words are, "She would have died hereafter." So that, yeah, a real cold, she would have died anyway. She was on the way to death. It would have happened at some point anyway. So he loses that closeness with her. We're going to look at another extract that doesn't have any of those quotes in on Monday, but hopefully that'll be helpful. I would recommend just learning those 3 quotes, particularly in terms of the essay. They are: look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under; be innocent of knowledge, dearest Chuck; and she would have died hereafter. They track the kind of beginning, middle, and end of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth's relationship.